Chapter 1. The Awakening of Darkness. A storm raged outside. The city, once alive with the pulse of its people, now stood cloaked in an unsettling silence. The streets were empty, shrouded in shadows, as if the very air was holding its breath. Thunder cracked across the night sky, the flashes of lightning revealing the crumbling buildings, their windows dark and empty, reflecting the storm's fury. Beneath the tempest, in a forgotten crypt deep within the heart of the city, an ancient vampire stirred. Drake, once a man of flesh and warmth, now an immortal curse to exist in darkness, opened his eyes. The pull of the storm outside did little to ease the chaos raging within him. He had slept for centuries, locked away in a tomb of stone and dust. But now, something had awoken him, an energy, an urgency that was impossible to ignore. His senses, dulled by age and slumber, sharpened as the overwhelming hunger surged within him. It was a hunger of the vampire, a gnawing need that had not been satisfied in centuries. Drake's hand clenched into a fist, feeling the coldness of his skin. Once warm, once human, now it was all ice, and his heart was nothing but an echo of what it once was, a beating memory, now lost. The years had stolen so much from him, but none more than Amara. She was the woman who had once owned his heart, the one who had made him feel alive. She was mortal, full of light and warmth, everything he had longed for. Their love had burned brightly, but it had burned too fast. Amara had betrayed him, and in that moment she had destroyed him. It was her betrayal that had cursed him to this eternal darkness. Memories of her flashed in his mind. Her soft laugh, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the feeling of her hand in his. But that was a lifetime ago, a lifetime that had ended in tragedy, leaving him bound to this cursed existence. The city he once called home was no longer the place of his memories. It had withered, consumed by shadows, just as he had. Something was wrong here, and Drake could feel it. The city was filled with death. Strange, unexplained deaths that made the very air thick with tension. As he walked through the streets, there was an oppressive sense of something far worse lurking beneath the surface. The city felt familiar but foreign. It was like walking through a dream that twisted and distorted the memories of a life he could no longer touch. The fog rolled thick along the pavement, swallowing the shapes of abandoned buildings, and the streets seemed to whisper, as if the very ground had a story to tell. He didn't know what had drawn him back, but he couldn't ignore it. Something or someone was waiting for him. The pull grew stronger as Drake walked deeper into the heart of the city. He felt in his bones a magnetic force that tugged at him, familiar but also foreign. His instincts screamed that it wasn't something he had caused. It wasn't his darkness that was calling him. A shape flickered through the mist, a shadow darting just out of his line of sight. Drake's heart, cold as it was, quickened, and a strange, instinctual hunger awoke deep within him. His eyes narrowed, his vampiric senses working overtime to catch the slightest movement. There was something in the shadows, something that had been waiting for him. And then, as if an answer to his thoughts, the figure emerged from the mist. She stood under a dim streetlight, her silhouette barely visible in the storm's fury. It wasn't her, but it was close enough. Evelyn. The name formed in his mind before he could even fully take her in. She wasn't Amara, but the resemblance was uncanny. The same sorrowful eyes, the same ethereal beauty that had once enchanted him. She was lost, just as he was. Her posture was tense, guarded, as though she was waiting for something or someone just as he was. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a connection. Evelyn stepped forward, hesitant, but there was something in her eyes, a curiosity, an awareness that mirrored his own. A strange electric current seemed to crackle between them, invisible yet undeniable. Drake's heart, a thing long dead, stirred at the sight of her. The pull, the longing was instant. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. She studied him closely, as though sensing the danger he carried, even without fully understanding what that danger was. Drake's mind raced, but he couldn't find the words. He knew this encounter was no accident. There was a reason why he had been drawn back here, and she was part of it. The darkness, the death in the city, and now her, it was all connected somehow. "I'm not who you think I am," he finally managed to say, his voice low, rough from disuse. Evelyn took a step back, her caution rising, but there was no fear in her eyes, just that same strange sense of recognition. Drake could feel it then. Whatever this force was, whatever had led him here, it was only the beginning. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was now brewing between them. There was no going back. The world seemed to close in around them, the wind howling louder as the shadows deepened, pulling them both further into the unknown. What had started with a whisper now felt like a scream, foreshadowing. Drake knew that this was just the start. Evelyn's arrival in his life was no coincidence. The city was filled with secrets, and he was about to uncover them all. Secrets that would forever change him and her. But even as their paths intertwined, Drake couldn't shake the feeling that the past was coming back to claim them both. Chapter 2, The Unseen Pulse. The city was alive with an energy Drake couldn't quite place, an undercurrent of something that pulsed through the very streets, electric and dangerous. It wasn't the storm that had raged the night before, nor was it the chaotic whispers of the city's inhabitants. No, this was something darker, deeper, ancient in nature. Drake could feel it in the air, vibrating in his veins, setting his senses on edge. It had been days since his return, and still the uneasy feeling gnawed at him. People were dying. The bodies were piling up, drained of life in the most violent and mysterious ways. But it wasn't the manner of death that intrigued him. It was a connection to his own past. There was something about these killings that seemed familiar. Drake had long since learned to trust his instincts. As a vampire, his senses were sharper than any mortal's, able to read the smallest of details, subtle clues hidden in plain sight. And tonight, the air was thick with them. He stepped into the alleyway, the scent of death lingering in the air. It was faint at first, but the smell of blood, of something wrong, pulled him deeper into the darkness. As he passed the crumbling buildings, their jagged edges illuminated by the faintest of moonlight, he could feel it, the pulse, a rhythmic thrum beneath the city's heartbeat, growing louder with each step. Drake paused, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the first body. It lay crumpled against the wall, an empty shell, pale and lifeless. There was no visible wound, no sign of the violence that had ended the person's life, but the faint, almost imperceptible symbol carved into the victim's neck sent a shiver through him. The symbol was ancient, too old, even for him to recognize with certainty. His mind raced, connecting threads he hadn't wanted to think about in centuries. Could it be the Order of the Night? The name echoed in his mind, a whisper of a long-forgotten past. The dark order that had once hunted him, driven by a desire to control the vampire world. But why would they be here now? And why were they leaving these bodies in their wake? Drake crouched down beside the body, his fangs nearly visible as his heightened senses took in every detail. The body was drained, bloodless. The victim had been chosen for a reason, though that reason was unclear. He let his fingers brush the symbol on the neck, cold, etched into the skin like some forgotten, twisted mark. His mind swirled with confusion, memories resurfacing, betrayal, loss, the weight of the curse that had bound him to the darkness. The symbol felt personal, like a cruel reminder of what he had once lost, of the war he had been dragged into, a war that was far from over. Then, without warning, a figure appeared at the edge of the alley, stepping out of the shadows like a phantom. A woman, Evelyn. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on the body that lay before her, the same chilling confusion marking her features. She wasn't afraid. No, that wasn't what he sensed in her. Instead, there was something else in her eyes. Recognition, a silent understanding, as if she, too, knew the sting of death, the taste of loss. Drake's gaze shifted, meeting her eyes for the first time. The moment felt like an eternity, a quiet understanding passing between them, without a single word spoken. His breath caught, and for the first time in days his heart fluttered, a sensation he'd long since forgotten. She stepped forward, crouching beside the body, her fingers delicately tracing the same symbol that had caught Drake's attention. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and confusion, but there was something stronger there too, determination. "You're looking for answers too," Drake finally spoke, his voice as cold and steady as the night air. He wasn't surprised. His instincts had been right. She wasn't here by accident. Evelyn's eyes snapped to him, her posture shifting slightly. She was strong-willed, he could see that. There was no fear in her, only a quiet resolve. "I've seen these deaths before," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "But these, they're different." Drake stood, towering over her, his gaze never leaving her face. "Different how?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The connection between them was undeniable, drawn together by the same pull, the same darkness. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers still brushing against the corpse. "They don't just die. They're taken." Her voice faltered slightly, but she held herself steady, like something is feeding on them, draining them dry. Drake's fangs tingled, an involuntary response to her words. This was no ordinary killing spree. Whoever or whatever was responsible wasn't just hunting for blood. They were after something more. He could feel it in his very bones. This was a ritual of sorts, a call to something darker, something that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. But he couldn't let her get too close, couldn't let her uncover the truth of what she was walking into. Not yet. His own path was dangerous enough without dragging her into it. "You should walk away, Evelyn," he warned, his voice rough with caution. "This is no place for you. You're too innocent for this." Her eyes flashed at his words, a spark of defiance lighting them. "I'm not innocent, Drake," she replied, the weight of her words not lost on him. "I've seen darkness in this world. I know what it looks like." She stood, meeting his gaze with equal intensity, "and I'm not afraid to face it." For a moment, there was only silence. Drake studied her, his mind racing. This was no ordinary woman. She was strong, far stronger than most. And yet, he could see the cracks in her, the echoes of a haunted past that matched his own. The pull between them, the connection they shared, was undeniable. "Stay away from this," Drake said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you're walking into." Evelyn didn't back down. "I'll walk into it, no matter what you say. There's something here, something I need to understand. And I'm not leaving until I have answers." Drake's fangs flashed as frustration boiled inside him. He wasn't sure if it was her words, her defiance, or the undeniable attraction that coursed through him, but something about her, about this moment, felt wrong. And yet, as much as he wanted to pull away, he knew he couldn't. She was already too tangled in this web, too connected to the darkness he couldn't escape. As the night deepened around them, the pulse of the city grew stronger, louder, closer. Something was coming, and whatever it was, it would bring them both face to face with a past they could never outrun. Foreshadowing Evelyn's involvement in these killings, her unspoken connection to the darkness that haunted Drake's life, would lead her into far more danger than she could ever anticipate. The shadows around them were growing, and in time, they would pull both of them into a conflict that neither was prepared for. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Desire. The city's pulse had grown quieter. But for Drake, the silence only deepened the unrest that had settled in his chest. His thoughts were consumed by Evelyn. Her eyes, her presence, the way she seemed to linger in his mind long after they parted ways. It was maddening, the way she called to him, even when he tried to push her away. Her defiance, her strength, her quiet understanding of the darkness he carried. It all pulled him in like a current too strong to resist. And yet, every time he allowed himself to get closer, every time their gazes locked for just a moment too long, he felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. Drake had lived for centuries, existing in the shadows, isolated from the world. His existence was built on control. Control over his hunger, control over his desires, and most importantly, control over the part of him that longed for something more, something human. But Evelyn threatened that control in a way nothing else ever had. Their encounters, at first brief and casual, had begun to stretch into something deeper, more dangerous. There was a chemistry between them now, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Every conversation with her felt charged, like a fuse burning dangerously close to an explosion. She didn't know what he was, not yet, but she was beginning to sense it, the tension in the air thickening whenever they were near. She was starting to notice the way he moved, the way he could be in one place one moment, and then, without a sound, disappear into the shadows the next. It was in the small things, how he always seemed to know where she was, even in a crowd, how his eyes would flash with something dangerous, something that made her skin prickle with both fear and fascination. And she hated that she couldn't look away. Evelyn had learned to trust her instincts, but her instincts now told her that there was something more to Drake than met the eye, something she didn't fully understand. That night, as the moon hung low in the sky, they met again in a small, secluded alley, one Drake had chosen, knowing the shadows would keep them safe. Evelyn, of course, had come willingly, though she couldn't quite explain why. Something inside her told her that the answers she sought could only come from him. "What is it that you're hiding, Drake?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper in the cool night air. He stood before her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were anything but indifferent. There was something raw there, something ancient, like he was barely holding himself together. It was a glimpse of the man he had once been, and a glimpse of the monster he had become. "I'm not hiding anything," he replied, his tone smooth but laden with something dangerous. "Not from you, at least." Evelyn stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I know you're not telling me the whole truth. There's something dark about you, something that pulls me in, something I can't resist." She spoke the words almost to herself, as if voicing the truth out loud might make it clearer in her own mind. Drake's gaze flickered with a glimmer of something ancient, something terrible. He took a slow step toward her, and despite herself, Evelyn didn't move. She stayed rooted to the spot, her breath catching in her throat as his presence loomed closer. "You think you can handle what's in me?" he asked, his voice low and impossibly smooth. "You don't even know what you're walking into, Evelyn." Her pulse quickened, but there was no fear in her eyes, only an undeniable pull, an attraction that defied every instinct she had. She had been trained to resist the darkness. She had grown up learning the ways of the vampire hunters, the very people who had fought against creatures like Drake. But standing here in front of him, she was drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. "Maybe I do know," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of desire and defiance. "Maybe I know that I can't stay away." For a long moment, they were locked in a tense silence, each of them struggling with the magnetic force that seemed to bind them together. And then, without warning, Drake stepped closer, too close, and Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. The air between them hummed with tension. He was so near now that she could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of blood, and something older, something primal. It was intoxicating, the way his presence filled her every sense. Without thinking, without meaning to, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The contact was electric, sending a surge of heat through her body. Her heart pounded louder, faster, as if it, too, was trying to match the rhythm of their connection. Drake's gaze darkened, his lips parting slightly as if he were struggling to maintain control. But Evelyn didn't pull back. In that moment, she wasn't sure why she was drawn to him, only that she was compelled to find out what lay beneath the surface. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You should leave now before it's too late." But Evelyn stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not until I understand." Her words seemed to pierce through the thick tension that hung in the air. For a moment, it looked as though Drake might push her away, might force her to leave. But then something changed. The hunger within him surged, an ancient, insatiable need. And before either of them could stop it, he reached for her, pulling her close. Their lips met, and the world seemed to explode around them. It wasn't a kiss of love, not at first. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of a need that neither could deny. It was dark, fiery, and filled with an intensity neither of them had expected. Drake's hands gripped her waist, pulling her even closer, as if afraid she might slip away. The darkness within him seemed to wake, to stir, in response to contact. Evelyn's body responded in turn. Her pulse raced, her skin tingled, and the world around them faded into nothing. But then, as quickly as it had started, it ended. Drake pulled back, his chest heaving with the effort to regain control. His eyes were wild, torn between the man he once was and the monster he feared he was becoming. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking with restraint. "This is dangerous. You're playing with fire." Evelyn stared at him, breathless and trembling, her own heart racing. "I don't care," she whispered. "I don't care about the danger, Drake. I just want to know you." Her words, simple and raw, hit him harder than any blow ever could. And in that moment, Drake knew that nothing would ever be the same. Their worlds had collided, and there was no going back. Foreshadowing, as their forbidden desire grows, so does the danger that surrounds them. Every moment they share brings them closer to a dark destiny neither of them is prepared for. But there's no turning back now, not when the bond between them has become too powerful to ignore. And with it, the shadows that have haunted Drake for centuries begin to stir once again. Chapter 4, The Mark of Eternity. The night was thick with tension, the air still and heavy as Drake and Evelyn walked through the desolate streets of the city. It had become their routine, These silent walks beneath the moonlight, away from prying eyes. But tonight, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unsaid, hovering just out of reach between them. Evelyn could feel it, the heaviness in his presence. She could see the battle within him, the way his jaw tightened with every step, as though he were holding back something deep inside. She had learned enough about him by now to know that there was more to Drake than the immortal creature he portrayed to the world. The hunger, the darkness, it was all a part of him. But tonight, she had the unsettling feeling that it was only a fraction of the story. She had asked him countless questions about his past, his true past. He deflected every time, retreating further into the shadows. But something in the way he moved tonight, the way his gaze flickered with a deeper sadness, told her that tonight was different. Tonight, the truth would surface. They reached an old, crumbling building on the edge of the city, a ruin that looked as if time itself had abandoned it. The stone walls, once grand and imposing, now stood jagged and broken, overrun with creeping ivy. It was here that Drake had brought her, as if to show her something from his past, something he could no longer keep hidden. "Where are we?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper in the cold night air. Drake didn't answer at first. His eyes lingered on the ruins, a haunted look in them. It was clear that this place held memories that shaped him, twisted him into the man, no, the vampire he had become. He stepped forward, and after a long moment he spoke, his voice low and distant. "This is where it all began," he said, his tone carrying an edge of something ancient, something sorrowful. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She stepped closer, her curiosity pulling her in, even as her mind screamed to tread carefully. She had been walking this dangerous line with Drake for days now, but this felt different. She wasn't just standing at the edge of his world anymore. She was about to cross into it. As they ventured deeper into the ruin, Drake's pace slowed. He stopped in front of a broken stone archway, and for the first time, he looked at Evelyn, not with the mask of the vampire, but with the eyes of the man he once was. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice thick with a sorrow that cut through the air. "Once, I was a man, a mortal man. I had a life. I loved deeply." Evelyn stood still, the air around her charged with something she couldn't quite explain. She had never seen Drake like this, vulnerable, raw, his past laid bare in the cracks of his voice. He was offering her a glimpse of the person he had been, the person he had lost. His eyes were distant, his mind lost in a time far away. "Her name was Amara," he continued, his voice a whisper, as though speaking her name brought both pain and longing to the surface. "She was my world. I loved her more than anything, more than I ever thought possible." Evelyn felt her heart tighten. There was something about the way he spoke about Amara that pulled at her chest. It wasn't just love he spoke of. It was a deep, soul-shattering bond, a connection that transcended time, a love so powerful that it consumed him entirely. "But she betrayed me." Drake's voice hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. "She turned on me. She was the reason I became what I am." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn took a step closer, her own breath shaky as she processed what he was telling her. He wasn't just a vampire, a creature of the night. He had been changed by a loss so profound. It had broken him, twisted him into something darker than he ever imagined. "Amara," Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with sorrow for him. "What happened?" Drake's gaze turned cold as he spoke the next words, as if the very memory of them burned him from the inside out. "She left me for power, greed. She betrayed me in the most unforgivable way, and I became a monster because of it. She made sure of it. The pain in his words was palpable, and for the first time, Evelyn understood the depth of Drake's curse. It wasn't just a thirst for blood. It wasn't just the eternity of isolation. It was the fact that he had loved, truly loved, and had it ripped away from him in the cruelest of ways. The betrayal didn't just change me, Drake continued, his voice darkening. It set off a chain of events. The curse was only the beginning. The order of the night sensed my grief, my loss, and they knew what it meant. They knew what my love for Amara could create. Evelyn's stomach churned. The order of the night, the ancient, secret society of vampires that had once hunted him, try and control the fate of their kind. She had heard whispers of them, dark rumors, but she had never understood their true power until now. They knew that my love for her, my pain, could open a door. A prophecy was foretold. Drake's eyes met hers, his gaze intense, filled with a kind of raw desperation. If I ever loved again, truly loved, it would bring about the destruction of the vampire realm. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. The words hit her harder than she had expected. She had always known there was something more to Drake, something that bound him to the shadows in a way she couldn't comprehend. But this was different. It wasn't just his immortality or his darkness. It was the very thing that made him human, his capacity for love, and it had the power to undo everything. But it's not just the order, Drake said, his voice filled with both anger and regret. It's her Amara. She's still alive, Evelyn. She's still out there, and she knows about you. About us. The words landed like a hammer blow. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat, the world spinning slightly as the weight of Drake's confession settled over her. Amara alive? The woman who had broken him, who had set all of this in motion, was still out there? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the pieces of this dark puzzle. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Drake turned away, his gaze locking onto the ruins around them as though searching for something in the fragments of his past. "Because I didn't want to drag you into this," he replied. "But the moment you walked into my life, I knew the prophecy had already begun. The Order has sensed us, Evelyn. They know we're connected, and they won't stop until they tear us apart." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn stood frozen, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. The prophecy, the Order, and the very love that had bound her Drake. It was all part of a much larger, much darker picture, and there was no way out now. Foreshadowing, as the revelation of Amara's survival hangs over them. The growing connection between Drake and Evelyn becomes not just a bond of love, but a beacon for forces far darker than they could ever anticipate. The prophecy that looms over them threatens to unravel their world, and the shadows are closing in. The danger has only just begun, and with each step they take together, they grow closer to a fate neither of them can escape. Chapter 5. The Forbidden Kiss. The air between them was electric, thick with tension, and the unspoken words that lingered in the spaces between every glance, every touch. It was as if the world had paused for a breath, holding on to the moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. They stood there in the dim light of the abandoned alleyway, the shadows curling around them like silent witnesses to the storm that was about to break. Drake could feel it, the pull, the magnetic force drawing him toward Evelyn. It was unlike anything he had ever known. More than the hunger, more than the dark ache inside him that had existed for centuries. This was something raw, something far more dangerous. The craving he felt for her wasn't just physical. It went deeper. into a place in him he had thought long buried, into his humanity. He wanted her, needed her, but that desire, as pure as it felt in the moment, terrified him. She was his weakness, the one thing that could undo the fragile control he had spent centuries building. His mind screamed for him to pull away, to protect her from the darkness that lay inside him. But his body, his very soul, was already lost. Evelyn, too, felt it, the magnetic pull between them, the way her heart pounded in her chest, the fluttering in her stomach as his proximity set her senses on fire. She had been fighting this attraction since the moment they met, but now, standing here with him, she could no longer deny it. She was drawn to him in a way she didn't understand, a way that felt as though she had been destined for this, for him. Her breath hitched as her gaze locked onto his, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw something in his eyes, something that mirrored her own inner turmoil. The walls he built around himself were beginning to crack, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the vampire, the loneliness, the centuries of torment, the love that had once been so pure, now twisted and broken by betrayal and the curse of immortality. "You should leave, Evelyn." Drake's voice was hoarse, laced with both warning and a desperate plea. He was standing on the edge, and he knew it. The abyss was right there in front of him, waiting to consume them both. "You don't know what you're walking into. I can't protect you from this." But she didn't move. Her eyes never left his, and there was a spark of something. Defiance, perhaps, but more than that, an understanding. She knew the danger. She had always known. And yet, here she was, choosing to stay, choosing to confront the darkness that pulled at them both. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Her voice was quiet but firm, the tremble in her chest betraying the intensity of the words. She took a step closer, her eyes burning with the same fire that blazed in his. "You're wrong, Drake. I'm not afraid of you. I want to understand you. All of you." His breath caught in his throat. The words were like a challenge, like a spark igniting the powder keg of desire between them. And then, as if drawn by some force beyond them both, his hand reached out, trembling as it brushed a lock of hair from her face. The touch was soft, yet it held a weight to it, as if he were both savoring the moment and dreading what might come next. The air between them grew thick, charged with something far more dangerous than just desire. It was a force that neither of them would control, a force that had built itself on their mutual yearning, their shared pain, their forbidden love. Without thinking, without any more words or warnings, their lips met. The kiss was everything. It was fire and ice. It was a collision of two souls, two lives that had been shaped by time and darkness, by loss and regret. It was a kiss that broke through the walls they had built, breaking down every barrier they had erected to keep the other at bay. There was no holding back now. No more games. No more restraint. As their lips met, Evelyn felt the heat of him consume her, his body, his essence, the darkness inside him that she had always sensed but never truly understood. She felt herself falling into it, losing herself in the kiss, in the overwhelming force of their connection. Her heart raced, and her hands found their way to his chest, pulling him closer, as if she could close the distance between them and the chaos that swirled around them. Drake was lost too, lost in the taste of her, the feel of her hands against his skin. For a moment, he forgot everything, the curse, the prophecy, the order of the night. All he could think of was Evelyn, and how she made him feel alive, made him feel something that had long been buried inside him. But as the kiss deepened, something dark stirred within him. The hunger, the darkness he had fought so hard to control. It flared to life, overwhelming him, clouding his mind, making him lose control. He pulled away sharply, breaking the kiss, gasping for air as he fought to steady himself. "I told you to leave," he whispered, his voice strained, dark with the shadows of his inner battle. "You don't know what you're doing, Evelyn. This isn't just some momentary desire. You can't walk away from this once it's begun." She stared at him, her lips still tingling from the kiss, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the pain in his eyes, the fear that gripped him, the fear that he might lose control, the fear that he might hurt her. But what she saw in him wasn't just a monster. It was a man who had been broken by centuries of loneliness, of loss. "I don't care," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Drake. Not now. Not after this." The words hung in the air, suspended between them like a fragile promise. But as the moment stretched on, something else took shape in the darkness, something more ominous. A shadow moved in the distance, a figure, and suddenly Evelyn felt it. The undeniable pull of danger, of something else lurking at the edge of their fragile union. Drake's gaze hardened as he pulled her closer, his senses on high alert. "We're not alone," he muttered, his voice tense. "Get back." But it was too late. The shadow grew, and from the darkness emerged the unmistakable silhouette of someone he had hoped never to see again. Amara. Her presence was suffocating, her beauty twisted by centuries of darkness, her eyes gleaming with an icy malice that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Evelyn's heart clenched as Drake stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. His lips curled into a snarl as he faced Amara, the air thick with old wounds and the promise of more. "This isn't over." Amara's voice was a low, dangerous purr. Not by a long shot. The night, which had once felt so full of possibility, now seemed to close in on them. The kiss, the forbidden desire they had shared, was only the beginning. The darkness was circling, and its consequences had only just begun to unfold, foreshadowing, as their passion ignites. So too does the danger that comes with it. Amara's return marks a turning point in their fragile connection, and the shadows that have long haunted Drake begin to close in around them. The forbidden kiss may have broken their restraint, but it's also awakened something far more dangerous. And now, the consequences of their union will shape not only their fates, but the fate of everyone caught in the web of darkness that binds them. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Heart. Evelyn felt the world shift beneath her feet, as though the ground had cracked open and swallowed everything she thought she knew. She had always been haunted by the shadows that seemed to follow her, the strange sense that there was more to her past than anyone, least of all herself, could understand. But standing in front of the old leather-bound journal Drake had handed her, her breath caught in her chest as the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. The pages were yellowed, fragile with age, but the words, every word, burned with a painful clarity. Her ancestors, her bloodline were hunters, vampire hunters, to be exact, and not just any hunters, ones who have been fighting and dying in secret wars against Drake's kind for centuries. She slammed the journal shut, the noise sharp and final, in the otherwise silent room. For a long moment, she stood there, the journal in her hands like a weight she could not discard. The walls of the room seemed to close in around her, pressing on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears, her heart racing in a way that felt entirely wrong. The anger, the betrayal, it swirled inside her like a storm. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of the question. She was speaking to Drake, though she didn't need to look at him to know he was standing just behind her. His presence like a shadow she could not escape. She had trusted him. He had become her anchor, the one person who had made her feel something real in a world that had felt empty for so long. And now she learned that everything had been a lie. Evelyn! Drake's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. She didn't want to hear it. Not now. Did you think I wouldn't find out? She spat, spinning around to face him, her chest heaving with the weight of the realization that I wouldn't remember my own blood, my own history. Drake flinched, the sadness in his eyes almost too much to bear. He took a step forward, but she held up a hand, stopping him. No, she whispered, almost to herself. No, this is too much. I can't be part of this. The words burned her mouth, tasting of betrayal. The air between them crackled, heavy with the unspoken truths that lay between them like a chasm. Drake's past, the darkness he carried inside him, had always been there, looming just beneath the surface, but now it felt like it was choking the very life out of her. She had always known there was something dangerous about him, but this was something deeper, something tied to her, something she couldn't outrun, even if she tried. I never wanted you to know this, Drake said, his voice strained, rough with regret. He stepped forward, but again she held him back with a glance. I want to protect you from it. From me. The words were soft, yet they landed with the weight of 1,000 years of guilt, of the curse that had bound him to the darkness. But that guilt only made Evelyn feel more betrayed. All this time, he had known who she was, what she was, and yet he had let her fall deeper into a world she was never meant to be part of. Protect me? She echoed bitterly, shaking her head. You think I need you to protect me from the truth? You should have told me from the beginning. Drake took another step toward her, his hand reaching out, as if to touch her, but he stopped, his eyes haunted. I couldn't risk losing you. You don't understand, Evelyn. If you knew what my kind did to your family, to your bloodline, how we hunted them, wiped them out one by one, you'd never be able to look at me the same way again. Her throat tightened at his words. The truth cut deeper than anything she could have imagined. The anger that had simmered inside her for so long boiled over, consuming her thoughts, clouding her judgment. She wanted to push him away. She wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare that she had no part in, that she never asked for. But something inside her held her still. A part of her still wanted to believe in him, to believe in the man he had shown her, the man she had started to care for. Then what am I supposed to do with this, Drake? She asked, her voice breaking. The words hung in the air, a raw confession. Am I supposed to just forget everything? Pretend none of this matters? Before he could respond, something in the air shifted. The coldness around them grew more intense, and Evelyn felt a strange chill crawl down her spine. She wasn't alone anymore. Her gaze flickered to the window, where the dim light of the moon barely cut through the heavy curtains. And then she saw it. A figure, dark and haunting, stood in the doorway. Her heart stopped in her chest. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face that was too familiar, too beautiful, too dangerous. Amara. For the first time, Evelyn felt real fear, a fear so primal it almost paralyzed her. She didn't know who this woman was, but the tension in the room told her everything she needed to know. Amara was no mere mortal. She was the source of the storm that had been building between her and Drake. And now she had come back to claim him. Amara's eyes locked onto Evelyn, the coldness in them unmistakable. So, this is the woman who thinks she can steal him away from me, she purred, her voice smooth like silk but laced with venom. How quaint. Evelyn's fists clenched at her sides, her entire body bristling with anger. She had no idea what kind of relationship Drake had with this woman, but she knew one thing for certain. Amara was a threat to everything she was beginning to feel for Drake. But Drake's eyes were on Amara, and they were filled with something she hadn't expected. Regret, guilt, like he was staring into the face of a past he couldn't escape. "She's back," he whispered, more to himself than to Evelyn. "And this time, she won't let me go." Evelyn's chest tightened. "What do you mean? What's going on, Drake?" Drake's face darkened as he turned to her, his voice low, almost a growl. "Amara is the one who turned me. She's the reason I'm a vampire. She's also the reason your bloodline was targeted, why they were destroyed." Evelyn's world tilted. This wasn't just a love story. This was far more complicated. Amara was part of the curse that had haunted Drake. She was the one who betrayed him, the one who had created this cycle of darkness. And now, Amara had returned, not just to claim Drake, but to destroy everything in its path. Evelyn wanted to push Drake away, wanted to scream at him, tell him to run from the woman who had shattered his soul and the one who was threatening to destroy her own. But something in his eyes, the raw pain, the depth of his regret, made her falter. "She's come for both of us," Drake said, his voice laced with a desperation that Evelyn had never heard before. "And this time, we don't have much time." The shadows in the room grew darker, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and Evelyn realized with a sickening certainty that her life, her world, was no longer her own. The vampire hunters, Amara's return, the curse that had tied Drake and her together. It was all one tangled mess, pulling them both toward a fate they couldn't escape. Foreshadowing, the storm is only beginning. As Amara's return and the revelation of Evelyn's bloodline collide, both are forced to face the ghosts of their pasts. The dark forces that once tore them apart are now closing in, and there's no way to avoid the inevitable confrontation. With Amara's power threatening everything they hold dear, Drake and Evelyn's bond will be tested like never before. The question remains, will their love be enough to survive the darkness? Chapter 7. The Scent of Betrayal. The night was colder than it should have been, the air biting as if the city itself knew something dark was about to unfold. Evelyn stood in the shadows of a crumbling alley, her heart pounding in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears. She had tried to push the fear away, tried to tell herself that she could face whatever was coming. But there was no denying the truth any longer. Amara was back. She could feel it in the air, the thick, suffocating presence of a vampire who had once been as much a part of Drake's past as his curse. The scent of her, an intoxicating blend of power, darkness, and something colder still, clung to the night, winding its way around Evelyn like a sinister embrace. Drake had gone quiet beside her, his silence heavy, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. His eyes were distant, as though he could feel Amara's presence even from a distance. She saw the tension in his jaw, the flicker of something darker behind his eyes. The weight of his history with her was unbearable. Amara had been the one who had turned him, who had twisted his life into the curse he now lived. She had been his first love and his greatest betrayal. But now she was back, and Evelyn, despite everything, still didn't know what to make of it. "She's more dangerous than you know," Drake said, breaking the silence in a voice so low it almost disappeared into the wind. "Her return, it's not just about us anymore, Evelyn. She's not just after me. She's after everything." Evelyn looked up at him, her gaze steady despite the storm swirling in her chest. His words echoed through her, yet the truth of them felt like an anchor, weighing her down. "You still care for her, don't you?" Her voice trembled, though she hated how much it did. The question hung between them, sharp and bitter, because she already knew the answer. She saw in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes momentarily clouded with memories that weren't hers to understand. "I don't want to," Drake admitted, his voice raw, as if admitting this weakness was a painful act of betrayal in itself. "But I can't deny the past, Evelyn. Amara, she is my past. And now she's back, forcing me to confront all of it again." The words stung, and Evelyn could feel the bitterness of them cutting through the fragile web they had been building. She wanted to scream, wanted to tell him to stop thinking about her, when they were standing on the edge of something far darker than any past love. But Evelyn's anger wasn't just directed at Drake. It was at herself, at the twisted fate that had entangled her in all of this. She didn't want to be caught in the middle of their war. She had her own battles to fight, her own demons to face. Her bloodline demanded vengeance. And yet here she was, standing at the precipice of a life she never asked for, torn between a man she was falling for and a legacy that demanded she destroy him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was never supposed to be part of this. I was never supposed to care about you, Drake. But I do, and that's the problem, isn't it? I care, and it makes everything so much harder." Drake turned to face her, his eyes dark with both guilt and longing. He reached out as though to touch her, but hesitated, knowing that every action, every word, every glance now carried a weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "We don't have to face this alone," he said softly. "You don't have to do this for me, Evelyn. I can fight Amara. I can end this. But you—" His voice faltered, and there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, something that made Evelyn's chest tighten. "You don't have to carry this burden. Not for me." But Evelyn knew that wasn't possible. The truth had already been set in motion, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the night, the tension that had built between them. It was her, Amara. She appeared as if summoned by the shadows themselves, stepping out from the alley's dark corner, like a ghost materializing from the depths of his nightmares. Her presence was a chilling echo of everything Evelyn had feared. She stood tall, poised, her skin as pale as the moonlight, her dark hair flowing like liquid ink down her back. There was a dangerous grace in her every movement, something predatory that made the air crackle with an ancient power. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the way Amara looked, more beautiful than any mortal woman had the right to be. It was the undeniable power she exuded, the kind of power that seeped into your bones, chilled your heart, and made you question everything you had ever believed in. But it was more than that, too. It was the tension in her smile, the challenge in her eyes. "You've become quite the hero, haven't you, Drake?" Amara's voice was a soft, melodic purr, but it carried a weight of warning. There was no mistaking the venom in her words, the cold disdain that laced every syllable. "I can see why you're so attached to this mortal now. She does look quite beautiful, doesn't she?" Her gaze flickered to Evelyn, a slow smile curving her lips. "But I think you'll find that the beauty of a mortal is fleeting." Evelyn's fists clenched at her sides, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and fear. She stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated by the woman who had haunted Drake's past. "What do you want?" Evelyn's voice was steady, but beneath it, there was an edge of desperation she couldn't hide. Amara's gaze shifted back to Drake, a spark of something darker flickering in her eyes. "What I want, my dear, is simple. I want everything you've taken from me, Drake. And that includes her. She looked Evelyn up and down, her smile never wavering. If you think for 1 second that you can protect her from me, you are gravely mistaken. The words cut through the air, sharp and final. Evelyn's heart twisted with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, fear, but most of all, a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was something deeper. This was a war that had been brewing for centuries, and they were all just pawns in it. Drake stepped forward, positioning himself protectively between Evelyn and Amara. The tension between them crackled with years of unspoken history and unresolved emotions. "You can't have her, Amara," Drake said, his voice dark and cold, a promise laced with danger. "I won't let you destroy everything again. Not this time." Amara's smile faltered, the briefest flash of anger flashing in her eyes. "You forget, Drake. I was the one who created you. And when I decide something belongs to me..." She paused, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Nothing, not even love, can keep it from me." The air was thick with the promise of a battle that would change everything. The fragile thread holding them all together snapped, and Evelyn felt herself caught in the middle. The choice between love and duty was now a matter of life and death. Foreshadowing. As the lines between love, loyalty, and vengeance blur, Evelyn is forced to confront the reality that there may be no way to protect herself or Drake from the forces that are closing in around them. Amara's return marks the beginning of a much darker path, one where every decision could lead to irrevocable consequences. As the battle escalates, the war between the past and present will consume them all. But which side will Evelyn choose? And will she be able to protect the man she loves from the shadows of his past? Chapter 8. The Descent into the Abyss. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the city, like a cruel reminder of all that had been lost. Evelyn could feel the weight of the night pressing against her, wrapping itself around her heart and squeezing, each breath heavier than the last. Every step she took felt like she was walking deeper into the shadows, further away from the life she once knew. And yet, there was no turning back now. Drake was walking beside her, but there was an undeniable distance between them. The bond they once shared, the connection that had grown out of longing, desire, and the weight of their shared pain, was now tainted. Amara had poisoned it, and the more Evelyn tried to reach him, the more Drake seemed to slip away, consumed by the darkness inside him. His eyes were distant, haunted. The darkness in them had grown stronger, feeding on his regrets, his guilt, and his uncontrollable thirst for power. He was no longer the man she had first met. He was something else, something darker. Every time she reached out to him, hoping to bring him back, he pulled further away. "Drake." Evelyn's voice trembled as she called his name, desperate for him to see her. For him to see her, and not the monster he feared he had become. Drake stopped, his gaze lingering on the empty street ahead, his posture rigid with the weight of his own thoughts. He was silent for a long moment before speaking, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on, Evelyn." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stepped closer, her heart aching as she placed her hand on his arm. "Don't say that. You're still in there, Drake. You can fight this." He looked down at her hand on his arm, his expression torn, before slowly pulling away. "Amara has already won. She's taken everything from me, everything." His words were harsh, the anger in them almost consuming. What if I can't stop myself from becoming her monster again? Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had known it was bad, but hearing him say it out loud, seeing the torment in his eyes, made the weight of it all crash down on her. The curse that bound him to darkness was slowly dragging him under, and no matter how much she wanted to save him, she couldn't do it alone. "You're not alone," Evelyn whispered, but the words fell hollow. She could feel the pull of his darkness, the fear that it would swallow him whole. And her too. Drake turned away, his fists clenched at his sides. "Amara's coming. And when she does, I won't be the man you fell in love with. I'll be nothing more than a weapon, a monster. And you'll hate me for it." "No." The word came out with such conviction that it startled even her. She took a step forward, her eyes locking with his, holding on to the last sliver of hope she had. "You're not that monster, Drake. You can still fight her." But even as she spoke, Evelyn knew the truth. The battle was no longer just against Amara. It was against the darkness inside of Drake, a darkness that was slowly consuming him, the abyss of the vampire underworld. They had no choice. If they wanted to save him, if they wanted to save themselves, they would have to venture into the heart of the vampire world, into the place where secrets were buried so deep that even the most ancient beings feared them. The journey wasn't one Evelyn was prepared for. She had heard rumors, whispers about the underworld, the dark magic that ruled it, the creatures that lurked in its depths. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The shadows seemed to reach for them, claw at their skin, as if the very earth beneath their feet wanted to swallow them whole. Drake led the way, his movements tense, his every step heavy with a weight Evelyn could barely understand. This was his world. This was the darkness that had shaped him into who he was today. And yet, it was also the only chance they had to break his curse. "What are we looking for?" Evelyn asked. Try to keep her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread tightening in her chest. Drake didn't look at her. He was focused on the path ahead. His eyes narrowed, as if he were searching for something in the blackness. "There's an artifact," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the shadows. "A ritual that can break the curse. But it's forbidden magic, and no one dares to use it." Evelyn's pulse quickened. Forbidden magic. The very words made her blood run cold. She knew how dangerous it could be, how it could twist a person's soul, leaving them worse than dead. And yet, if it was the only way to save Drake. "I don't care what it costs," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "If it's the only way to save you, then we do it." Drake stopped, turning to look at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deep and sorrowful, that made Evelyn's stomach churn. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Once I step into the abyss, there's no coming back. This is the end of the line. It's not just my curse. It's everything I've done, the blood I've spilled, the things I've become. Once you walk into the heart of this place, there's no turning back." Evelyn reached out, her hand brushing his. The coldness of his skin sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't pull away. "I don't care about your past, Drake," she said fiercely. "I care about you." His gaze softened, but there was a sadness there that broke her heart. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," she insisted, lifting her chin. "And I'll go wherever you go. We'll face this together." For a moment, there was a heavy silence. And then Drake nodded, slowly, reluctantly, as if he was giving in to something far greater than himself. The weight of their choices, the weight of the past and future, pressing down on them both. Together, they stepped into the depths of the vampire underworld, the heart of darkness. The deeper they went, the more the world around them seemed to change. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy, a dark, pulsing force that seemed to resonate with the very core of Evelyn's being. It was a place where time didn't exist, where the rules of the mortal world had no power. They passed through caverns and tunnels lined with jagged stone, walls etched with symbols older than anything Evelyn had ever seen. The further they descended, the more the darkness seemed to feed on them, growing stronger the closer they came to their destination. "There's no going back now," Drake murmured, his voice tight, almost fearful. "Once we reach the heart of this place, there's no escape, no second chances." Evelyn nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel it too, the overwhelming weight of the ancient magic, the power that seemed to stretch and pulse beneath the earth, wrapping itself around their minds like a suffocating embrace. Finally, they reached a vast, open chamber deep underground. The floor was slick with blood, ancient blood, the kind that had been spilled by creatures long forgotten. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, covered in carvings that seemed to come alive under the dim glow of the torches that lined the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old magic, a mixture of blood, death, and something darker still. "This is it," Drake said, his voice barely a whisper. Evelyn swallowed hard. She didn't know if she was ready for this, for the power they were about to unleash or the consequences it would bring. But she knew one thing for certain. She would do anything to save him. And so, together, they prepared to face the heart of the abyss. Foreshadowing, the darkness they are descending into will test their relationship in ways they can't yet understand. The magic they seek to use will come at a high cost, one that could either save them or destroy them both. As Evelyn faces the truth of Drake's curse and the dangerous powers they're about to awaken, the line between saving him and losing him forever grows thinner by the second. The abyss is waiting, and neither of them knows if they will ever come back. Chapter 9. The Heart of the Beast. The air was thick with tension, the shadows pressing on them like a living, breathing thing. Evelyn's heart raced as they entered the ancient crypt deep beneath the vampire underworld. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy so dark, it felt like it could swallow her whole. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. The stakes were higher now. Everything they had fought for, everything they had endured, was leading to this moment. Drake was walking beside her, but the distance between them had grown wider than ever. His body was still, but his presence seemed to vibrate with an ominous energy that Evelyn could barely comprehend. The curse was consuming him, eating away at the man she had fallen for. The darkness inside him was like a living thing, an ancient beast awakening from a deep slumber. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. The Drake she knew was slipping away, and in his place, something far more dangerous was emerging. She looked at him, her heart aching, but his face was unreadable, eyes locked ahead. He wasn't the man he once was, and Evelyn couldn't tell whether he was afraid of what he was becoming or if he had already given in. "Drake," she whispered, reaching for his hand. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "We're close. We can do this." Drake didn't answer at first. His jaw clenched as he stared into the darkness ahead, the weight of their shared past dragging him down. He turned to her slowly, his expression haunted, his eyes colder than they had ever been. "You don't understand, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice strained. "There's no escaping this. Amar's grip is tightening. I can feel it. And if I let it consume me, if I give in to the darkness, there's no turning back. I'll be the monster I've always feared I would be." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The curse, the power, the ancient bloodline. She had known it was dangerous. But hearing Drake say it, watching him battle his own demons, made her realize how much worse it had all become. "No," she said, her voice fierce despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You're not the monster, Drake. I won't let you be. We can break this curse." "We have to." Drake looked at her, his eyes flickering with something darker, something regretful. "And what if I don't want to be saved anymore?" The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they landed like a blow. "What if the man you love is already lost?" Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. Her heart broke for him, for them. She wasn't just fighting for Drake anymore. She was fighting for their future, for the hope of a life beyond the shadows that had haunted them both. But that hope was starting to fade, and the reality of what lay ahead was clearer than ever. The ritual of sacrifice, the crypt they had entered, was ancient, older than anything Evelyn had seen before. There was an air of forgotten power about it, an oppressive stillness that seemed to reverberate through the stone walls. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, a tome bound in blood-red leather. The book was a relic from the darkest corners of vampire lore, a guide to the ritual that could break Drake's curse. Evelyn approached the pedestal with trepidation, her fingers trembling as she opened the book. The pages were worn, the ink faded with age, but the words still held the power to make her blood run cold. "This is it," she whispered, reading aloud. "The ritual of the eternal dawn. To break the curse, the price is life." Her voice faltered as she scanned the words, her breath quickening. The one who performs a ritual must sacrifice their own life energy to sever the ties of the darkness that binds a vampire to the underworld. In doing so, they will erase the curse, but their soul will be lost to the abyss. Forever. Drake's breath hitched behind her. He stepped closer, his voice tight with urgency. "No, you can't. Evelyn, you can't do this. There must be another way." Evelyn felt the weight of his plea, but she couldn't turn away from what she had just discovered. The truth was right there in front of her, written in blood and ancient magic. To save him, she would have to give up everything. Her life, her soul. She would be lost, a mere shadow, a forgotten echo in the abyss. But Drake, he was everything. And she couldn't bear the thought of losing him, of seeing him consumed by the darkness. "I can't lose you," she said, her voice shaking, but her resolve hardening. "I won't." The battle within. But as Evelyn grappled with the weight of the ritual, she felt it, the change in Drake. His presence was shifting like a storm-gathering force. The darkness inside him was stirring, rising. Amara's influence was growing stronger by the second, clawing at him, whispering promises of power, of releasing the curse, if only he would let go. Drake's hands trembled at his sides. His chest rose and fell rapidly, the internal battle becoming too much for him to control. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes flashed with an unnatural light. His fangs began to elongate, his skin turning cold as the vampire king inside him began to awaken. "You don't understand, Evelyn." Drake's voice was low, dangerous. "I need this. I want this." His eyes glowed with an eerie hunger. The power. The freedom. "No, Drake." Evelyn reached for him, desperation creeping into her voice. "This isn't you. You can fight this. I know you can." But the look in his eyes was far from the man she had once known. It was a cold, vicious hunger. The ancient vampire king within him was stirring, and Evelyn could feel the presence of the monster that lurked in the darkness. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and Evelyn's heart ached as she realized the full weight of what was happening. Drake was slipping away. "You can't save me, Evelyn," he whispered, the darkness now fully consuming him. "It's too late." The room seemed to spin around her, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She had to act quickly, The price of the ritual, was the only way to save him. But what if the cost was too great? What if she couldn't bear it? What if, in the end, saving Drake meant losing herself forever? The choice. Tears burned the back of Evelyn's eyes as she stood before him, torn between love and duty, between the man she loved and the man he was becoming. She had to make a choice that would determine their fate, one way or another. "Please, Evelyn," Drake begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. I'm not worth it. I don't deserve this." Evelyn's heart broke. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't. The darkness was only part of him, his curse, his battle, but not his soul. She took a step closer, her voice steady, but her heart shattering. "I don't care what you think you deserve, Drake. I love you, and I will never leave you." She raised a dagger, the one she would use to perform a ritual, the blade trembling in her grip. The ritual was simple. She had to sever the ties between Drake and the darkness that consumed him, but it would come at a cost that neither of them could predict. The moment her hand closed around the hilt of the dagger, the air around them thickened, charged with the magic of ages long forgotten. The weight of the decision pressed down on Evelyn like 1,000 pounds. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Drake's eyes were wide, panicked. "Evelyn, please, please don't." But it was too late. The ritual had begun. Foreshadowing, Evelyn's decision will change everything. The ritual will either break the curse and save Drake, or it will destroy them both. With Amara's influence continuing to grow stronger, Evelyn's sacrifice may be the only way to sever the ties of the darkness that bind them both. But what will be left of their love if she gives up everything? And if Drake is freed from the curse, what kind of man will be left in his place? Chapter 10. The Final Embrace. The night was heavier than any they had endured before. The air was thick with the scent of blood and ancient magic, as if the very earth itself had been stained by the conflict that had led them here. The city was in chaos, consumed by the shadows that had been building for centuries. It was a culmination of everything they had fought for, everything they had lost. Drake stood at the edge of the desolate courtyard, his eyes locked on the distant figure of Amara. She was standing under the pale light of the moon, her presence as commanding as it was suffocating. She was everything he had once desired, and everything he now loathed. His past and present clashed within him, pulling him in two directions, toward the woman he had once loved, and toward the one he had grown to love. Amara's eyes glinted with an unsettling mix of amusement and cold certainty. She had been the architect of his downfall, the one who betrayed him, and yet there was something magnetic about her, a cruel reminder of the world he had once known. Her voice sliced through the silence, sharp and sweet. "You've come far, Drake," Amara said, her words smooth as velvet, but laced with venom. "But this is where your journey ends. Your love for her, it makes you weak. You cannot save her, not from me, and certainly not from the darkness within you. You are mine, Drake. You always have been." Drake's jaw clenched. Every fiber of his being screamed in defiance. He wasn't the same man he once was. He had fought too hard, had suffered too much, to let her have any hold on him now. His gaze flickered to Evelyn, standing a few paces behind him, her hand gripping the hilt of a dagger, a weapon she had once sworn she would never use against him. Evelyn. She was the reason he hadn't given up, the reason he had kept fighting, even when the darkness inside him threatened to consume him completely. She was his salvation. But the curse had always been there, lying in wait. Amara had resurrected it, and now it was stronger than ever. The battle was not only between them, it was within Drake as well. The beast inside him was too powerful. It was the reason Amara had come. She wanted him back. She wanted to make him her king again. Evelyn took a step closer to Drake, her eyes searching his face. She could see the struggle within him, the war waging between the man she loved and the vampire he had become. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid words, with the weight of decisions that neither of them was ready to make. "Drake, don't listen to her," Evelyn said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "You're not hers. You never were. You belong here with me. I won't lose you." Her words pierced through the darkness inside him. The cold, vicious voice of Amara faltered, if only for a moment, but it was enough. Drake's eyes softened. The flicker of the man he had been, of the man he still could be, flickering in the depths of his gaze. "Evelyn," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer, like a promise. "I love you, more than anything, but I don't know if I can protect you from what I've become. You don't deserve this." Tears stung Evelyn's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had made her choice. She had known the risks when she stepped into this world, when she chose to stand by him, no matter the cost. And now, standing before him, she would face it all. "I'm not afraid of you, Drake," she said fiercely, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not afraid of the darkness, because I am with you, and together we can fight this. Together we can beat her." Drake's fists tightened, his fangs elongating in response to the darkness swirling around them. He could feel it, the rage, the hunger. It was all there, gnawing at him from the inside. And yet, the warmth of Evelyn's words, her unwavering belief in him, kept him grounded. Amara's laugh echoed through the courtyard, mocking them both. "How noble," she sneered. "How very touching. But in the end, it won't matter. You can't escape who you are, Drake. You can't escape me." With a swift, fluid motion, Amara moved toward them, her figure shifting like smoke, her power manifesting in waves. The air crackled with the dark magic she wielded, and Evelyn braced herself, knowing what was coming. She gripped her dagger tighter, ready to fight to the very end. But before she could act, a surge of power erupted from Drake. His body trembled, his eyes glowing with an intensity that was both terrifying and beautiful. The darkness had taken hold of him, fully, completely. And yet, in that moment, Evelyn saw something else in him, the remnants of the man she had fallen in love with. "I'm not yours, Amara," Drake said, his voice cold, yet determined. "I'm no one's." With that, the battle began. The final confrontation. Amara lunged at them, her hands crackling with dark energy. But Drake was faster. He moved with the deadly precision of the vampire king he had once been. But now, there was a difference. He was fighting not just for survival, but for the woman he loved, for the future they could have together. Evelyn stepped forward, her dagger gleaming in the moonlight, and with a single fluid motion, she threw herself into the fight. She had never imagined herself as a warrior, but with Drake at her side, she was ready to become one. The magic that swirled around them was dangerous, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning inside her, inside them both. The battle raged on, each blow bringing them closer to the heart of the beast. Every strike, every move, was a reminder that they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the love they had fought so hard to protect. But even as the fight reached its peak, as the air hummed with power and tension, Drake knew the truth. The curse would only end one way. The darkness that had been a part of him for centuries could not simply be defeated with strength or will. It would take something more, something he had feared for so long. The choice love, or sacrifice. The battle between the three of them reached its final moments, and as Amara faltered, weakened by the combined force of their defiance, Drake knew what had to be done. Evelyn's life, her soul, was the only key to breaking the curse, the final piece of the puzzle. Evelyn, he gasped, his voice broken. This is it. I can't protect you any longer. You have to let me go. Evelyn's eyes widened with shock. She shook her head, stepping closer, unwilling to accept what he was saying. No, I won't lose you. But Drake's gaze was filled with sorrow, regret. He stepped back, taking her hands in his fingers trembling. If we want to end this, we have to sever the bond. The darkness within me is too powerful, Evelyn. Only your love, can free me, but it will come at a cost. Tears filled her eyes as she understood. He wasn't asking her to give him up. He was asking her to make the ultimate sacrifice, the one that could save them both. With a final, heart-wrenching kiss, Drake whispered, I love you, always. And then, with all the love and pain they had shared, Evelyn made the choice. She let the darkness consume her, her soul entwining with his in a final, eternal embrace. The curse shattered, the bond was broken, and in that moment they were free. But the cost was greater than either of them could have ever anticipated. The twist, the price of love. As the dust settled and the remnants of Amara's power faded into the night, Evelyn collapsed into Drake's arms, her breath shallow, her life force slipping away. The ritual had worked. The curse was gone. But so was Evelyn. She had saved him, but in doing so, she had given up everything, her life, her soul. She was now a shadow, a lingering memory in the vampire's world. But Drake held her as she slipped from this world into the next, knowing the price of love was the hardest one to pay. I'll find you, he whispered, his voice cracking with grief. I'll always find you. And as the final chapter of their story closed, the weight of their love, their sacrifice, and their eternal bond lingered in the air, heavy as the night itself.